We're going to continue today in our story of Samson. It appears in the middle chapters of the book of Judges. We finished chapter 14 last week. Today we're going to begin chapter 15, and we're going to get a little way, actually, into chapter 16. Now, when we left off, Samson had spotted a Philistine girl that he wanted to marry. And so he disrespectfully demanded that his parents go and negotiate a marriage contract for her. Properly so, Samson's parents objected to this because this girl was not a Hebrew, and no Hebrew man, let alone a Nazarite Hebrew, should ever consider marrying a pagan Philistine, but his father gave in and did as Samson wanted. A 7-day-long Philistine-style wedding ceremony ensued that was fashioned around a banquet. 30 Philistine men were invited as companions of the groom, undoubtedly because no respectable Israelite was going to accompany Samson into Philistine territory so that he could marry a Philistine girl. And at this ceremony, it was Samson's duty to entertain the guests. So one popular means of entertainment in his day was to offer up a riddle. But Samson also spiced the game up a little bit by attaching a wager and a handsome prize to anyone who guessed the correct answer. But that game also came with a hook. If the guests lost the wager, they would owe Samson a heap of valuable clothing. Well, the riddle concerned that lion that Samson had secretly killed on his journey to Timnah when his parents first met Samson's future bride. And then on the next trip, for the actual occasion of the wedding, Samson stopped out of curiosity to view his handiwork and found to his delight some bees had set up a hive and produced honey inside the carcass of that dead lion. Now, since he was alone on both occasions with the lion, the riddle he offered, with the lion, by the way, being the answer, was unsolvable, meaning it was quite unfair, even insulting to his guests. And the wager that involved expensive clothing made the matter all the more delicate, and the guests, sensing they had been duped, went to Samson's bride and demanded that she use her womanly wiles to get the answer to the riddle from Samson and then to divulge it to them. I mean, after all, these were her fellow countrymen, and besides that, they threatened her and her father's lives. Well, after several days of crying and whining and complaining to Samson, Samson finally caved in to stop this flow of tears. And he told her what she sought, and immediately she went to the wedding guests with the solution. Samson, of course, felt betrayed. And only hours before the 7-day wedding ceremony was to conclude, he stormed off in a huff, walked 20 miles to the Philistine city of Ashkelon, and there he murdered 30 men for their clothing in order that he could pay off his wager for these guys having figured out the riddle. These 30 Philistine men he killed were at random. They had no part in the wedding. So from that standpoint, they were just innocent victims of a serial killer. So Samson was probably never actually married. And we find that the humiliated father of the jilted girl eventually gave her to Samson's best man, who of course was a Philistine man, since Samson had never returned to finish claiming his bride. Let's continue with Samson's story by reading Judges chapter 15. Judges chapter 15. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it's page 288. But after a while, during the wheat harvest season, Shimshon, Samson, went to see his wife. And he brought a young goat for her and said to her father, I want to go to my wife in her room. But he wouldn't let him in. And her father said, I really thought you hated her altogether, so I gave her to your best man. But her younger sister, isn't she even prettier? Why not just take her instead? Samson said to them, this time I'm through with the Philistines. I'm going to do something terrible to them. So Shimshon went and caught 300 foxes. Then he took torches, tied pairs of foxes to each other by their tails, and put a torch in the knot of every pair of tails. Then he set the torches on fire and let the foxes loose in the wheat fields of the Philistines. In this way he burned up the harvested wheat, along with the grain waiting to be harvested, and the olive orchards as well. The Philistines asked, who did this? And they answered, Shimshon, Samson, the son-in-law of the man from Timnah, because he took Samson's wife and gave her to his best man. Then the Philistines came up and burned both her and her father to death. Samson said to them, I will certainly have my revenge on you for doing such a thing, but after I do, I'll stop. Infuriated, he began killing them right and left. It was a massacre. Then he went down and stayed in the cave at the Etam rock. Well, the Philistines went up and pitched camp in Judah and attacked Lehi. The men of Judah said, why are you attacking us? And they replied, to arrest Samson, that's why, to treat him the way he treated us. Then 3,000 men from Judah went down to the cave at the Etam rock and said to Samson, don't you know that the Philistines are our rulers? What are you doing to us? And he answered, I've only treated them the way they treated me. And they said to him, we've come down to arrest you and hand you over to the Philistines. And Shimshon replied, swear to me that you won't fall on me yourselves. They said to him, no, but we will tie you up and hand you over to them. However, we promise not to kill you. So they tied him up with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. When he got to Lehi, the Philistines came running and shouting at him, and the spirit of Adonai came on him powerfully. The ropes on his arms became as weak as burnt flax, and they fell from his arms. He found a fresh donkey jawbone, took it in his hand, and with it he struck down 1,000 men. And Shimshon said, with the jawbone of a donkey, I left heaps piled on heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey, I killed 1,000 men. And after he finished speaking, he threw the jawbone away, and the place came to be called Ramat Lehi, Jawbone Heights. Then he felt very thirsty. So he called on Adonai, saying, you accomplished this great rescue through your servant. But I am now to die from thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? Then God made a gash in the crater at Lehi, and water came out. And when he had drunk, his spirit came back, and he revived. This is why the place was called Ein HaKoreh, the spring of him who called, and it is there in Lehi until now. He judged Israel in the period of the Philistines for 20 years. So some undefined amount of time passed, and the wheat harvest season arrived, which means it was around late May, maybe early June, the time of the holy celebration of Shavuot, or Pentecost. Samson's anger finally had subsided sufficiently that he decided he would go back to Timnah to see this woman he called his wife. Now, the word used for wife in Hebrew is ishe, which can mean woman or it can mean wife, depending on the context. So it's hard to know what he had in his mind about his relationship with this girl. Was he married to her or not? I mean, for sure, he must have felt he had some ownership claim, or he would not have expected to visit this girl in her personal chambers. Very immodest. The girl's father explained the situation to Samson. They had no idea what to make of Samson abruptly leaving the wedding ceremony, but since he hadn't ever come back, and so much time had elapsed, they could only assume that Samson didn't want her anymore. So the father gave the girl to another man. Now, the answer to what was actually happening here might be in the young goat that Samson was bringing to him. Why would he be bringing a gift? And why would it have been considered important enough to include the gifting of a goat in the account? Now, it's usually taught that the young goat was a present of reconciliation. And while that's possible, it's hard to imagine that such a common and rather inexpensive item would have been suitable to apologize for this tremendous insult and boorish behavior that Samson had displayed several months or more earlier at his own wedding. But instead, there's another and much more likely possibility. There's an ancient Middle Eastern custom that, by the way, is still practiced today in some Middle Eastern cultures, called sadaqah. And it was, and it still is, followed by men who have no permanent habitation. And thus their wife is allowed to remain with her parents on a more or less indefinite basis. It's also recognized as a marriage of lesser status than a more typical one, where a husband and a wife set up their own household together. This sadaqah is probably an evolution of the concubine relationship, whereby a man takes a woman to live in his household, but she is not given a marriage certificate, or she married under a chuppah. She wasn't given a wedding ceremony. Yet she does have many rights similar to a wife. Now, in modern times, the husband in this kind of a marriage in the Middle East is called Jaz Masorib, that literally means a visiting husband. And in this system, it is the husband's duty to bring the wife a gift each and every time he comes to visit her. It doesn't even have to be a real valuable gift, but it can't be so small as to be insulting. And a goat kid would probably fit that bill just about right in that era. So in our case with Samson, he says in verse 1, I want to go to my Ishe in her room. No man would be allowed into a single woman's private chambers, nor could a married woman have a male visitor other than her husband or her father in her own room. Such a thing just wasn't done and could easily bring the death penalty for violators, both for the visitor and the visitee. So Samson obviously thought he had some kind of marital relationship with this girl, probably of the sadaqah kind, but the father thought otherwise. Now, seeing that Samson arrived surprised and upset, certainly not wanting to further anger this renowned man of violence and impulsive behaviors, the father offered the girl's younger sister to him. She's even prettier, he says. Why not take her as kind of a nice trade? Now, while that seems a little uncivilized to us, it was usual in those days for such a transaction, and the father was making a sincere attempt to make things right, as he could, at least, under the circumstances. Of course, Samson wasn't having any of it, and another rage overcame him. So Samson's determines he's going to take revenge for this perceived offense against him. And it was going to be against the Philistines in general. You know, it's self-evident that Samson seem to lump all the Philistines together. If one Philistine insults him, then all the Philistines are open to blame and are fair game. I mean, what a strange man Samson was. He seemed to hang out regularly in Philistine territory, and he even had a hunger for Philistine women, yet he had some type of deep-seated burning hatred towards the Philistines as a group. I think it might even be fair to say that he was rather bigoted towards them. I mean, after all, that you could take any race of people and decide that the actions of one equal the actions of them all, it's kind of hard not to see this as a kind of bigotry. Yes, of course, the Philistines ruled over Israel at this time, and so the Philistines were hardly the good guys. But you know, any soldier who has fought on foreign soil will tell you that it is a dilemma to mentally separate the innocent civilians from the military troops who are trying to kill you. Yet most soldiers instinctively know there is a difference, and they have to conduct themselves in that knowledge. Now, I also realize that one might legitimately argue that since God was kind of mucking around in the middle of all this with Samson, that perhaps Samson was responding to a righteous kind of impulse within him to destroy the Philistines. But his other actions indicate that Samson really didn't seem to care very much about what God thought or what God's laws and ordinances were. Samson operated primarily in a self-centered manner by doing what was right in his own eyes with very little self-control, not hardly any wisdom in the mix. He decides then on a rather inventive kind of collective revenge upon the Philistines. He captures 300 Shual, binds their tails together in pairs, ties a lit torch to them. Now the animals race off in panic and confusion, and in the process, the flaming torches that they drag behind them set the dry, ripe wheat fields on fire. Now, a shual is not actually a fox, not at least as we think of these cute little reddish dog-like animals. Rather, they're more akin to jackals. Foxes are solitary animals, and it would be near to impossible for one man to trap 300 of them. Jackals, on the other hand, travel in packs. So there is a possibility of capturing several all at once. Now, while I don't have a great need to have pets, although I do, I like animals. And while I don't subscribe to the PETA sort of animals are people too philosophy, animals should be treated with kindness. God prescribes that man is to be humane even with the creatures used for sacrifice or grown for meat. What Samson did was downright cruel to these shual. I mean, it's not hard to imagine many of them being severely burned, others killed, and every last one of them traumatized to the extreme. He used them as a tool for his personal revenge, caring little for their fate and suffering. So, I mean, this is becoming an all too familiar trait of this Hebrew strongman. Now understand, just like any ancient society, these fields of grain were the livelihood of the common folks. And while these folks were indeed Philistines, who God ultimately once removed from the promised land, they weren't monsters. They were just simple farmers. And much of the wheat crops that they depended on were now destroyed. And in addition, it was common to plant wheat among olive trees, so many of the olive trees also got burned down. Interestingly, unlike some of his earlier adventures, we don't find any reference to Samson being given divine strength and influence to set the fields on fire. We also don't find any reference to the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, coming upon Samson in this case. So without more to go on, it would be reasonable to assume that this was nothing more than Samson obeying his own evil inclinations. Were the results something that Jehovah would use for his purposes? The result being that the Philistines would become violently upset with the local Israelites in general? Absolutely. The Lord's primary purpose for Samson, let's remember, was to undo the ungodly peace and the resultant syncretism between his people and his enemies. Did the Lord approve of wanton cruelty and just indiscriminate destruction? Not a chance. Not then and not now. So in verse 6, the Philistine farmers begin to ask one another if they knew who might have done this. Someone must have witnessed it, because without hesitation, Samson was fingered as the culprit. But unfortunately, these same farmers were informed that this happened because Samson's almost father-in-law had denied Samson's bride to him and given her to another man. And it was this that drove Samson to burn down their crops. So the Philistine farmers went as a mob to the man's house, and he burned it down with him and his daughter inside. They died. And when Samson found out about this atrocity, he decided he would reciprocate by killing some more Philistines. Kind of a familiar cycle, isn't it? You know, it's so interesting how humans under stress can react. Because these Philistine farmers had no interest in taking on Samson, whom they couldn't even deal with, they blamed their misery on someone who they determined had upset Samson, and someone they could more conveniently extract some revenge upon, no matter how misplaced the idea of it. We have a great deal of blame America going on in our time, because some people who are absolutely petrified of Islam want to shift blame to our government and our military for acts of terror perpetrated by radical Islam upon us. I mean, I remember when 9/11 happened, that the knee-jerk reaction of millions across America was first to blame our government for not preventing the attack. Second, to ask, very interestingly, what had we done as Americans to offend Islam such that it would cause them to hate us and harm us so much? Now, regarding Israel, we have an almost worldwide consensus that the homicide bombings of public buses and the constant rocket attacks and purely civilian neighborhoods coming from Gaza and the maniacal desire of a dozen Muslim nations to annihilate Israel is because Israel's done something to offend them. It's Israel's fault that their neighbors constantly attack them and want them all dead. And the only reason, other than an underlying anti-Semitism, that this irrational attitude persists throughout the world is because the world fears Islam. If Austria or Argentina or Belgium were coming after Israel, it'd be a different story, because none of these nations frightens anybody. I've said on multiple occasions that history is circular. It repeats itself over and over in identical patterns because people don't change. And the way the universe operates and God responds never changes. So for the world to shift blame to the victim Because to deal with the perpetrator is fraught with difficulty and danger. This is an age-old solution. Well, after Samson went on another random killing spree upon whatever Philistines crossed his path, he left Philistia and he went to a cave at a place called Etam Rock. Now, actually, what happened here is that, as he said in verse 7, he would stop killing once he had extracted some undefined amount of blood from the Philistines that seemed to satisfy his personal sense of justice. He would be through with his murdering. So retire to this cave to withdraw from the conflict and just be left alone. Good luck. Not only were the Philistines hardly ready to forgive and forget, but also the God-ordained purpose of Samson's birth was to create all this turmoil and disrupt the peace process. Like I said, history's circular. I'm sure the majority of you have put it together that what we see happening here between Samson and the Philistines is once again happening between Israel and the modern-day Philistines, the Palestinians. I mean, can anybody doubt that the intractable problems of the Middle East and the Israel problem are the Lord's will? I'm about to say something pretty politically incorrect, so close your ears if you're sensitive about this. The Lord does not want peace in the Middle East, at least not yet. The Lord does not want peace in the Middle East, at least not yet. And this is because the kind of peace that men are wanting and striving for is man-made. It involves compromising God principles, and it means Israel has to essentially give up on the covenants that God made with them. If the Palestinians weren't harassing Israel, somebody else would. Before there was such a thing as Palestinians, Jordan was Israel's archenemy. Before them, Egypt, Iran, Iraq. If the leaders of Israel and a growing segment of Israelis weren't so willing to give up much of the Holy Land, half of Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, and so intent on showing respect or tolerance for the false god Allah, Jehovah wouldn't be allowing the never-ending murderers row lineup of hostile nations to oppress Israel and keep trouble stirred up so that such misguided efforts as that roadmap to peace or that Oslo Accord from a while back couldn't possibly happen. And guess what? It hasn't happened. I mean, we have today, for example, the Israeli police occasionally forcibly evicting Jewish settlers from settlements in Judea and Samaria that only a few years earlier, these settlements were encouraged and financed by the Sharon government to live there. Why? Because many within the current Israeli government, with unceasing international pressure upon it, think that by giving this land to the enemy will be appeased, and then they'll accept Israel. Besides, since the Israeli government can't seem to defeat the enemy, then they'll shift the blame for the failed peace process to people they can more easily deal with, their own Israeli citizens, Jews, who still believe in God's promises and covenants. See, the same seemingly unsolvable dilemma that is in the Middle East today was very much the same way in Samson's day. In fact, it is this instability and constant violence from the enemy and Israel's disobedient response to it all, instead of repenting in their ways, returning to the Lord. That's the hallmark of the days of the judges. And it's that same way again in our time, and for exactly the same reasons. History is circular. Now, naturally, the Philistines figure they got to do something about Samson. I mean, despite being constantly defeated by this one-man wrecking crew, they're ready to try again. So in verse 9, some Philistine soldiers went to Judah, attacked a town called Lehi. Etam-rock, where Samson was living, was also in Judah and was pretty nearby. The local Hebrew inhabitants of Judah were puzzled over why the Philistines were attacking them. They thought they had good relations with the Philistines. But when the residents of Lehi found out that the Philistines were after Samson, and in reality they were extracting some payback upon the Israelites just as Samson indiscriminately burned the fields of random Philistines, the men of Judah were more than happy to help the enemy capture Samson if it meant the Philistines would leave him alone. Of course, the Israelites of Judah knew Samson. They respected his amazing strength, so they sent a contingent of 3,000 men to try and subdue him. Well, when they found Samson, they were right up front. They told him they were going to turn him over to the Philistines. Now, Samson knew these people well, so he requested only that they don't kill him themselves. Now, the irony of this is that instead of sending an army of 3,000 men against their Philistine oppressors, these Judahites, Israelites, go after one of their own in order to appease their oppressor. They ask, in regards to Samson's personal war against the Philistines, "Why are you doing this to us?" Fighting the enemy disrupted their otherwise comfortable lives, as they were more interested in preserving a satanic peace with the Philistines than fighting a holy war to rid the place of them like they were supposed to do. See, Samson obtained their promise only to bind him and turn him over to the Philistines. So they tied him up with new ropes, meaning the strands of the rope were still moist. So that's when it's at its strongest. And when they got to their village of Lehi with Samson, the Philistines were ecstatic. Wow! Samson is captured. And they got those stupid Israelites to do it for them. What a great deal. But for the first time in a long time, suddenly the Spirit of God, we're told, that invests Samson with an even greater strength than usual, comes upon him. He bursts the ropes like they were nothing. He looks around, he finds the jawbone of a donkey conveniently lying nearby, and he began swinging it at the heads of hundreds of Philistine soldiers who had only moments before stood in relief they didn't have to face this guy. The jawbone was fresh in the sense that the sun hadn't dried it out yet, so it became brittle. Samson's words as he kills Philistine soldier after Philistine soldier is a poem, and it's a play on two words: donkey, ass, right, and heap. And as is more common in Hebrew than you might think, the same word can mean two entirely different things. So at times in the Bible, we'll get some nonsensical English translation because the translator wasn't aware of the alternate meaning of a word. Both donkey and heap use the word chamor as their root. This play on words is best translated then as, with a donkey's jawbone, I heaped heaps. With a donkey's jawbone, I killed 1,000 men. So what we have is that after killing a large number of Philistines whose bodies piled up in a heap, he chased down more of them and did the same thing to them, creating another heap of corpses. In fact, the way the Hebrew works, it could have been several more than just 2 heaps. So we find out how the place where this massacre took place came to be called Ramat Lehi, which means Jawbone Heights or Jawbone Hill. So the battle concluded, leaves Samson exhausted and thirsty. There had been no time to refresh himself, and apparently there was no nearby water source. So in a rare moment of proper spirituality, Samson acknowledges it was the Lord who won this battle. It was the Lord who preserved Samson's life in what only seemed to be a one-man fight against staggering odds. He says to God that he's grateful to God, that God has seen fit to accomplish such a great rescue through his servant. Well, I'm afraid that while Samson was quite aware of his calling as a Nazirite for life, thus calling himself God's servant, and he was God's tool to begin to liberate Israel from the Philistines, he was probably by far the most unfaithful of all the judges. And he paid but lip service to his God-ordained status as a Nazir, a Nazirite. Well, Samson is now weakened, both by dehydration, just the sheer physical exhaustion from a fight that probably went on for most of a day. So he would not be able to withstand another attack if other Philistines had decided to join in. And as God had done in the days of old, long before Samson, the Lord sprung forth water from a rock to satiate Samson, and he was revived. Let's move on now to chapter 16. Judges chapter 16. Go to page 289 if you have a complete Jewish Bible. We're going to read this long chapter, but only get into it a little ways. Samson went to Gaza, where he saw a prostitute, and he went in to spend the night with her. The people in Gaza were told that Samson had come, so they surrounded the place where he was and also set up an ambush for him all night at the city gate. Now their plan was to do nothing at night but to wait until morning and then kill him. However, Shimshon stayed in bed until midnight. And then he got up and took hold of the doors of the city gate and the 2 posts as well, pulled them up, bar and all, hoisted them on his shoulders, and carried them up to the top of a hill overlooking Hebron. After this, he fell in love with a woman who lived in Sorek Valley, whose name was Delilah. Now the chiefs of the Philistines went up to her and said, "Coax him into telling you where his great strength comes from and how we can overcome him so that we can tie him up and subdue him. Now if you do, each of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver." So Delilah said to Samson, "Please, tell me what it is that makes you so strong, how someone could tie you up and subdue you." And Samson replied, "If they tie me up with 7 fresh bowstrings that have never been dried, I will become as weak as any other man." And the chiefs of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings which had not been dried, and she tied him up with them. Now she had people lying in wait inside in the inside room, so she said to him, "Samson, the Philistines have come to you." But he snapped the bowstrings as easy as a piece of straw breaks when it touches fire, and the source of his strength remained unknown. And Delilah said to Samson, "You're making fun of me. You're telling me lies. Now come on, tell me what it takes to tie you up." "All it takes," he answered, "is to tie me up with new ropes that haven't been used. Then I'll become weak and be like anybody else." So Delilah took new ropes and tied him up and said to him, Samson, the Philistines have come for you. The people lying in wait were in the inside room. But he broke the ropes from his arms like a thread. And Delilah said to Samson, till now you've been making fun of me, telling me lies. Tell me what it takes to tie you up. And he said, if you weave the 7 locks of my hair across thread on a loom. So she fastened her cloth work in the loom with a pin and wove his hair in, and then said to him, Samson, the Philistines have come for you. He awoke from his sleep. He pulled away the loom pin and the interwoven cloth. And she said to him, how can you say you love me when your heart isn't with me? Now 3 times you've made fun of me, and you haven't told me the source of your great strength. Every day she kept nagging at him, pressing at him, till it bothered him to death. So he finally told her everything. And he said to her, no razor has ever touched my head, because I have been a Nazir of God since I was born. If someone shaves me, then my strength will leave me, and I'll be like any other man. When Delilah saw that he really had confided in her, she sent and summoned the chiefs of the Philistines with this message. Come up this one last time, because he's finally told me the truth. The chiefs of the Philistines went up to her and brought the money with them. She had him go to sleep in her lap, called for a man to shave off his 7 locks of hair. Then she began tormenting him, but his strength had gone away. She said, Samson, the Philistines have come for you. And he woke from his sleep and said, I'll get out this time, just as I shook myself loose before. But he didn't know that Adonai had left him. So the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and took him down to Gaza. There they bound him with 2 bronze chains, put him to work grinding grain at the mill in the prison. However, after the hair on his head had been cut off, it began growing back again. The chiefs of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to their god Dagon. And as they celebrated, they sang, our God has handed over to us our enemy, Shimshon. Upon seeing him, the people praised their God. Our God has handed over to us our enemy, who destroyed our land and killed so many of us. And when they were in high spirits, they said, summon Samson to amuse us. So they called Samson out of the prison, and he amused them. And when they put him between the columns, Samson said to the boy holding him by the hand, let me feel the columns supporting the building so that I can lean on them. The building was full of men and women. All the chiefs of the Philistines were there. In addition to them, there were about 3,000 men and women on the roof watching as Samson performed. Shimshon called to Adonai, Adonai Elohim, just this once, please. Think of me and please give me strength so that I can take revenge on the Philistines for at least one of my 2 eyes. Shimshon got a good hold on the 2 middle columns supporting the building and leaned on them, one with his right hand and on the other with his left, and then crying, let me die with the Philistines, he pushed with all of his might, and the building collapsed on the chiefs and all the people inside. So he killed more at his death than he had killed during his life. His brothers and all his father's family came down, took him, brought him up and buried him between Sorah and Eshtaol and the tomb of his father Manoah. He had judged Israel for 20 years. Well, the final words of the previous chapter were that Samson had judged Israel for 20 years. Now, first of all, he didn't judge all of Israel. Only the area in the former territory of Dan, and only the northern part of Judah that were under the thumb of the Philistines. The Philistines only presented a problem for a relatively small part of the land of Canaan, but a few of the 12 Israelite tribes were troubled by them at this time. Now, this 20-year reference is not meant for us to think that 20 years had passed since the donkey jawbone incident and the mention to begin chapter 16, that Samson went down to Gaza and engaged the services of a prostitute. We don't really know how much time had passed. Probably a few years had gone by. Apparently, the Philistines had stopped pursuing Samson after he single-handedly killed 1,000 of them with nothing more than a donkey's jawbone. But what we ought to take notice of is that Samson created havoc with the Philistines for a substantial amount of times, perhaps 2 decades. In yet another violation of his Nazirite vow, Samson got involved with a Philistine prostitute down in Gaza. Yes, this is the same Gaza we read about, hear about, and know about today. It's the same. Samson seemed to really have a thing for Philistine girls, didn't he? There is no record of any interest of Samson in a Hebrew girl. Would he actually venture all the way from his home in Torah to Gaza simply to use a Philistine prostitute? Perhaps. While prostitution went on in Hebrew society, it was not well accepted like it was in Philistine culture. You know, it's amazing that the Philistine army didn't immediately come after Samson, but I suspect they were just hoping he'd be a good boy this time around, kind of enjoy himself, and go home without decreasing the Philistine population again. But the townspeople of Gaza weren't so pragmatic. When they heard Samson was there, they set up a trap for him. They were going to wait for him to come out in the morning, and then they were going to kill him. So the stage is set for yet another conflict between Samson on Israel's behalf and the Philistines. Well, the foolish Gazans surrounded the place where Samson was staying, but Samson must have sensed something was up. So it says he arose at midnight. But rather than stealthily stealing out of town, I mean, let's face it, Samson didn't do anything stealthily. He went to the city gates. He broke the lock and with superhuman strength lifted those city gates off their pivoting pins and walked off with them. I mean, I can't even imagine the gaping mouths that stood looking at the hole in the city's defensive wall and their missing gates as the morning sun peeked over the eastern hills. I mean, there's no reason to try to make the city gates escapade any less than what it actually is. City gates are not small, nor could a single human ever contemplate lifting one of them. These gates were made of heavy wood planks, usually put together using large iron spikes. And by that time, iron sheeting often covered the outer side so that it couldn't so easily be burned down. But Samson didn't just take the gates down. He carried them off on his shoulders. It says he took them to a hilltop and presumably tossed them over. Now, depending on your translation, it either says that he took the gates to a hill in Hebron, or he took them to a hill towards Hebron. Hebron was 40 miles away. It's at a 2,500-foot elevation, so it's uphill all the way. So it makes little sense that he would have taken them quite that far. Almost certainly he took them on a road that was towards Hebron and arrived at some intermediate place on a hill from where he could see Hebron from a pretty far distance. Well, in verse 4 begins one of the most infamous stories in the Bible, the story of Samson and his love affair, albeit a pretty one-sided love affair, with the stunning temptress Delilah. That story is going to take some time to deal with, so we're going to stop here for today and take it up the next time we meet.